Just to round off the financial recompense part of today, can I ask all of you what your view is on whether financial recompense should be a devolved matter, what the advantages and the disadvantages of it from your perspective might be? Simon, I don't know whether you want to start.
I will, yes. I think I've already outlined my concerns about that, in the sense that money needs to come from central government. It is morally the responsibility of government prior to devolution at any stage. Central government and practical issues relating to healthcare were derived from the core, and I think that issues around finance are tied to that responsibility, and it's not a responsibility of the devolved nations. I believe the money must come from the Treasury, and I believe that government must do that as part of its recognition and acknowledgement of the situation. The reality is, on the basis of the last couple of years, even if we'd had a minister in prior to that, he would have been, or she would have been, struggling to find the finances to provide the uplift. And bear in mind, an uplift in Northern Ireland was £1.3 million, not 45 million, not 33 million, not 23 million. So under those circumstances, it would be meaningless. It would be a meaningless gesture to make it a devolved matter. It would be senseless.
What do the others
think? I agree. Yeah, I agree entirely with Simon. The money has to come from the Treasury. It shouldn't come out of the health budget because of all the additional stress that causes people, and that's often been used by blockers in the Department of Health to say, oh, well, you know, this money needs to be used for something else, and people are made to feel that they're begging for money, and that just is just horrific for people to think that. And then when they speak to members of the general public who don't understand what's gone on, people think, oh, those people are stealing money from NHS budget, and they don't get the sympathy they rightly deserve.
I agree with both Simon and Lynne, but I'll qualify it. When the Scotland Act was passed, who could have thought that there would be a liability on the new Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Parliament? And this takes me back to my point about how much devolution there was prior to 1999. So I've actually discussed this at quite a high level. And I see my conclusion in all of this, that the problem going back was frankly the Treasury. There's if you look at a statement associated with the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, then who's the person responsible for the control of public spending? In other words, they're the person that stops money coming out. Then we need to go to the door of the Treasury. My qualification is responsiveness and accountability. And that's where we see an advantage in Scotland. You know, it's bloody hard work coming down here to pin down people in power. It's a lot easier to build relationships positively with devolved government. And therefore, I firmly believe that we need to stick with a responsive government in Scotland. One of the questions we were asked during the financial review was, do you want to stick with a sort of charity type? Lynne talked about the problems with McFarlane Trust. One of the problems we had was that we were asked by the Minister, do you want that sort of arrangement, but with a Scottish setup? Or do you want a responsive, directly accountable scheme? Now, SIBS is part of, in effect, the Scottish Department of Health. And she was very interested in that, and she backed us because we made the decision that we wanted to nail people. And when I'm dead and gone, there'll be, you know, people can be nabbed. And I think that that's an element of this that what I want to avoid is a situation where there's a ding-dong battle between government in Scotland and government down south. So that's my qualification. But there is clearly an issue in terms of ultimately who pays, and I would one other point that I'd overlooked was when we had the financial review in Scotland, the Scottish Finance Minister in 2016 came up with £20 million from the health budget in Scotland. Going back to this Susan Deacon attitude, and I'm sorry, sir, but I think this just illustrates what we've been through. This is when she's talking about her fears about.
Do you want to give me the number of the?
Yeah, 029, witness 029.
So WITN 2287-029.
And if you go to the page with her picture on.
It's page 5, Shumik.
Have you got it?
Yeah, if we maybe could scroll down rather than our teeth. If you look at the second bottom.
I'm not sure everyone's.
Oh, sorry.
Right, it's right. Thank you.
If you look at the second bottom line there, this was Susan Deacon in, let me work this out, around about 2001, 2002. A worst case scenario involving compensation to around 400 people might cost us £20 million. It took us 15 years to get there because of that point of view. So, yes, the money has to come from the Treasury.
Lynne, Simon, do you have any views on that point of yes, it comes from the Treasury, but there's a qualification?
Sorry, Lynne first.
Oh, go on, Lynne.
Yeah, I would say from our perspective that we, at this moment in time, we wouldn't be able to say that we would want to have any sort of scheme because we haven't consulted with our group, and that's what we're going to be doing over the next. And obviously, I've sent out to our members that our next meeting will discuss this very issue. So I don't really, but definitely the money has to come from the Treasury. It shouldn't be left to the devolved governments.
Simon, did you want to chip in?
I just make a comment. Yes, I think the reality is that the government cannot pay currently for its responsibilities in Northern Ireland, and they would be looking to government in England to increase payments that come in so that they could manage their responsibilities. From that point of view, it's illogical that they could possibly deal with this. In terms of constraints on government, this is it's early days in terms of how monies would be agreed. Similarly with Lynne, we're currently talking to colleagues in relation to how arrangements for compensation might be delivered and considering different routes for that. So beyond that, at this point, I wouldn't really want to comment.
I want to move on to two issues. Firstly, a question about look back in Scotland, and then quite a lot on clinical treatment in Wales and also in Scotland and Northern Ireland. But in relation to the look back, Bill, there was a particular series of documents you wanted to raise. So if we could have WITN 2287-053, please. And if we could have page 5 of it. What we're looking at is a note of a meeting on the 10th of February 2000. In fact, Shumik, could we have page 2 so we can all see what this meeting was? We can see at the top a note of a meeting in SAH to discuss the information required to assist in the examination of circumstances surrounding the safety of SNBTS blood products from hepatitis C. And if we go on to page 5, please.
Before we do that,
Of course.
could I just point out that the handwritten note, the annotation on the front page about the attendance is my wife's handwriting?
If we look on this page, we've got paragraph 9, and there's lots of underlining an annotation, and I think, as you say, the annotations are your wife's, made during the Penrose inquiry. Is that right?
Yes.
The paragraph reads, Professor Lowe pointed out that most patients would have been infected whilst their predecessors were in post, and asked whether it was necessary to contact them to make them aware of the situation. Mrs. Towers explained that this was a factual information gathering exercise, but that it should be borne in mind that the information might be used in future court actions. Professor Ludlam also sought advice on whether haemophilia directors should be looking back to try to identify what had happened to patients whose whereabouts and status were unknown. Mrs. Towers confirmed that Central Legal Office was representing the trusts and SNBTS, and that the haemophilia directors should therefore follow CLO advice on whether any further investigation or the tracking down of patients was necessary. In relation to Mrs. Towers, do you know who she was?
She was from the solicitor's office within government.
I want to look at the next document and then ask you about both documents at the same time. If we can go to WITN 2287054. And this is the report of a Scottish Government commissioned short life working group published in August 2016. And if we can turn to page, I think it's probably your page 6, Shumik. Excellent. Under the heading Executive Summary, we see that it says, the Penrose inquiry published on May 25th, 2015 recommended that the Scottish Government takes all reasonable steps to offer an HCV test to everyone in Scotland who had a blood transfusion before September 1991 and who's not been tested for HCV. A short life working group established by the Scottish Government was asked to consider what specific action should be taken in the context of the inquiry recommendation, and then it carries on, to assess the extent of the problem, i.e. the estimated numbers of living HCV-infected individuals who acquired their infection through blood transfusion in the UK pre-1991 and who remain undiagnosed. It then carries on to say that it's estimated that approximately 100,000 people, if we can go over the page, it's estimated that approximately 100,000 people who received a blood transfusion pre-1991 in Scotland are still alive. Approximately 100 of those 100,000, 0.1%, are HCV infected. Around 30 of the 100 remain undiagnosed. And if you bear with me, following through to 2021, WITN 2287055. Page 2, please, Shumik. We have a Freedom of Information request which asked, with regard to the implementation of the second recommendation of the Penrose Short Life Working Group, you're asked for how many individuals were traced and how many couldn't be traced, and secondly, how many of those traced were alive and how many had died. And then if we go to the next page, the response. Just under the heading Response. Based on the information we received from Health Protection Scotland in 2018, of 69 patients whose status was investigated as a result of the Short Life Working Group recommendation, 33 patients were traced by linkage analysis and 36 could not be traced. Of those traced, 20 were alive and 13 had died. Bill, you wanted to draw our attention to these documents. Can you tell us what your concerns are, particularly about that first document in relation to the questions from Professor Ludlam?
This issue has haunted me. And it's to a certain extent, sir, already partly been addressed by questions to both Professor Ludlam and Professor Lowe when they gave evidence. But my conclusion is that people, as a consequence of the Central Legal Office's advice in February 2000 were allowed to die. And it's haunted me because I went and asked some questions about what had happened. I asked Dan to see if he could follow it up with government. We see a number here of 13 had died. We don't know how they died. Now, bear in mind that during the Short Life Working Group, Professor Campbell-Tate was asked to go, not only in a follow-up to the Penrose inquiry did they look for those who'd been not identified who'd had a blood transfusion, but Campbell-Tate actually went away to look at those who'd been, like myself, a mild haemophiliac, but contact had been lost. Campbell found, I think it was 69 names. And, you know, we've got some stats in front of us here. 36 could not be traced. If this exercise had been conducted 15 years before, it would have been a lot easier to find those 36 people and not worry about whether or not they might bring out a lawsuit. You actually treat them, support them, save their lives. Now, I realise that this is a very serious accusation, but why on earth were lawyers determining public health decisions? Because we were a walking public health issue. Why were those lawyers? And remember, this was during the time of Susan Deakin. The Deputy Chief Medical Officer was at that meeting. The other thing that scares me about this is, where did the power lie at that time? We've got senior consultants from the haemophilia world, but the lawyers were calling the shots. It's a disgrace, this. It's an absolute, we talked about this being a public scandal. This is one of the worst scandals that happened in Scotland. I'm sorry, sir, but I've been very deeply disturbed about this, and this is worthy of very deep investigation. People need to be held to account here. You can't just allow people to wander around and not go and try and find them. The fact that that Short Life Working Group managed to do that exercise 15 years later shows that you can at least make the effort. They didn't make the effort. I'm sorry, sir, but it's wrong. Sorry, Lynne.
Can I add something to
Yeah.
what Bill has just said? I've got 2 points to make. What always concerns me is the fact that this is the 1991 cut-off date, and we know there's people in Wales who were infected after 1991. So why is that the cut-off date? And that means that people aren't able to claim support. The second point is that the point you raise about specific to Scotland, my experience is that is happening in the Department of Health in England. I've been in meetings where they've talked about hepatitis C look-back exercise. I don't think it ever happens, and particularly for the haemophilia cohort, all that would need to happen is the National Haemophilia Database holds all the data on the patients. The clinic notes that all the haemophilia centres would have all the information. We know there was nearly 100% infection rate with hepatitis C, so it would be fairly easy to find those figures for the haemophilia cohort. Again, more difficult for transfusion because they are, they're individuals and they're not part of a cohort. But my opinion is that the Department of Health and Government don't want to find out how many people are infected, because if they did, they wouldn't be able, they would just argue that they couldn't pay for it and they couldn't afford it. And yet at the same time, we go to parliamentary debates and we hear about the massive figures that the amount it's going to cost to compensate all these people. They just pluck a figure out of the air. So they overestimate, but they make no attempt to find these people. And most people just die and it's never recorded. And again, it goes on to this issue about why isn't everybody offered a hepatitis C test? Why do people have to go and seek one out? Why have they got the 91 cut-off point? Why don't they just offer it to everybody? Or just a really simple question to the patient, have you ever had a blood transfusion? It's not difficult to ask a patient that. Some people might have had an operation and they don't know they've had one, but generally I think most people would know if they'd had a blood transfusion or not. And if they wanted to find the people, they would do that. They don't want to find them. That's the reason why.
Good. I absolutely agree with Lynne here, because this episode characterises government attitude on this whole episode. We've talked about the word cover-up. This is indicative. This characterises the cover-up. And these are people. They're not just numbers, they're people. And I think in respect of what Lynne's saying here, you know, this wasn't about them, whether or not they'd qualify for the money, and let's get it less. This was about treatment, the NHS, saving people's life. Lynne's right. And in the early days of the Scottish Government, it was still happening. I'm sorry, sir. This is just horrible.
Simon, is there anything you want to add?
Yes, again, I think this comes back to the heart of the issue of responsibility, and responsibility is vested in those whom we put our trust in. And obviously, preventative care is also about being prognostic and knowing the scope of the problems that have to be dealt with in relation to healthcare and health treatment. If the reality is that there is an assumption, and a reasonably well-informed assumption that there is a bigger problem out there without actually trying to address it, then that is a mistake, because that bigger problem will be a bigger problem. And a bigger problem is what we want to try and avoid on the back of this public inquiry. This is about lessons learned. And lessons learned means that action needs to be taken. And in terms of Northern Ireland, I would have relative confidence that certainly in terms of the infected blood community, contaminated haemophiliacs are well protected and well looked after. There's a knowledge of their need, and we've got a very good health centre here for haemophiliacs under Dr. Benson. I would have a greater concern in terms of the broader victims, the broader infected, contaminated group, and how clear government is about the numbers that actually entails. And unless we know, we don't know. And that is saying that makes it simple and clear.
If I can move on to a different topic. Lynne, a lot of your work over the years has also been in campaigning for the provision of services within Wales. You mentioned the psychological support, and the outcome of that, I think, was that there's now 4 haemophilia psychologists in Cardiff, Swansea and Bangor. The hepatology provision in Wales has been much more vexed from your statement. It's right, isn't it, that from 2007 there was no hepatology care in Wales after the hepatologist left his post?
In South Wales, yes, in South Wales.
Task...
Sorry, I need to correct that. I mean, in Cardiff area, there was a hepatologist at Swansea, but there wasn't one at Cardiff.
A task and finish group was established in 2011 to consider haemophilia care in Wales, and it reported in June 2011. Can we look at that? I want to turn to a couple of documents and then I'll ask you about them. WITN 3988013, please, Shumik. And if we start at page 2, please. We can see under the heading background On the 8th of March 2011, the previous Minister for Health and Social Services made a statement about the support available to individuals infected with hepatitis C and or HIV by NHS-supplied blood transfusions or blood products and their dependents. As a result of a commitment made during her statement, a ministerial task and finish group was established under the chairmanship of the Medical Director for NHS Wales to review services for people with inherited bleeding disorders. And then we have a heading, Summary of Patient Concerns. And we can see a number of matters which are underlined. But if we carry on over the page, we see as number 8, clinical support services. And it's noted, gaps in the provision of various clinical support services are apparent. This is most significant with regard to the hepatology service at Cardiff and Vale University Health Board. And then if we carry on to page 5, please, Shumik. We have a heading, Gaps Identified by the Task and Finish Group. The main gaps in services identified by the group were lack of counselling and social work support across Wales, lack of hepatology support, particularly in Cardiff. And we then carry on to page 8, where hepatology is picked up again, where the recommendation is that LHBs, through their joint work on WHSC, should ensure appropriate consultant and specialist hepatology nurse input into the treatment of patients with inherited bleeding disorders must be provided in Cardiff. Before I ask you about that, Lynne, could we also look at the ministerial announcement, WITN 3988014, please, page 2. This was on the 1st of November 2011, arising from the review. And if we see in the second paragraph, the effective management of patients with inherited bleeding disorders is complex and involves the provision of comprehensive care by a team of healthcare professionals with diverse skills. The group therefore considered a range of issues raised by patient groups on the planning and delivery of diagnosis, treatment and support services, including physiotherapy, counselling and social services support for people with inherited bleeding disorders in Wales. And then just after that, the review made a number of recommendations. The Welsh Government is providing £96,369 additional funding on a recurrent basis to support counselling services for those with inherited bleeding disorders, which was one of the main recommendations contained within the report. When this ministerial announcement was made, what was said about hepatology?
Nothing.
And what concerns did that rise?
So obviously, when they talk about patient groups, that's our group, and we know everybody, and we got all the patient experiences together. And the number one concern was access to consultant hepatology opinion. And when they announced, so that was. We work collaboratively with the haemophilia clinicians in Wales, and I know, we know them all, and there were patient representatives as well. And that was the number one concern that was put forward to government. And when the announcement came, the funding was allocated for psychological support, which was needed, but it wasn't the priority at the time because the psychological support was already too late because people had already died, and why couldn't those support services have been in place before they died, and maybe they wouldn't have died? So we could never really resolve that issue. And what made our group really cross was the fact that the 96,000 was allocated, but we felt that was just an easy win to put that in the announcement. It looked like Welsh Government were doing the right thing, and we are grateful for that because obviously we did end up with our 4 psychologists. But there were issues around physiotherapy as well, and obviously we spoke to the haemophilia clinicians and the other members of the Task and Finish group, who gastroenterology lead, and there were all multidisciplinary input, haemophilia nurses as well, physios, social workers. And basically, I don't know whether you're going to show these emails, but there are emails in my statement which shows the support that the haemophilia doctors in Wales had for the patient's number one concern, because they knew that it was such a concern. And the haemophilia doctor, particularly in Cardiff, felt that, you know, it was much needed, and he'd made a case for that to the health board, to Cardiff and Vale. But there was, you know, nothing happened. Basically, they were ignored. So we had a group of haemophilia doctors, the Welsh doctors. They were supporting what the patient group was saying. We documented all the patient experience. We had various meetings, but basically there was no money. And we knew that unless Welsh Government allocated funding for it, it would then turn into an argument between Cardiff and Vale Health Board and the commissioners in Wales for haemophilia care, which are Welsh. They're called Welsh Health Specialist Services Committee, because neither of them would want to fund the appointment. And the critical thing was that if they appointed a hepatologist at Cardiff, at the Heath Hospital in Cardiff, that if it wasn't dedicated for monitoring of haemophilia patients, or better still, monitoring infected blood patients, nobody would want to fill that post, because they'd have to do all the general day-to-day gastroenterology duties and, you know, emergency. So our group of patients still wouldn't have any benefit out of it. So the only way it could work is if the funding was specifically allocated for access to consultant hepatology for the infected blood group. And that would mean that they would have a priority access, and they would get regular clinic appointments, and they would be monitored. And, you know, that it does happen in Cardiff, but I think across the UK it's not happening. And I know people, it's, you know, that's true.
And your concern was that you didn't want a generalist, a general gastroenterologist.
Yes, yeah.
You were campaigning for a specialist hepatologist.
Yes.
To deal specifically in hepatology.
Yeah. So the clinicians, they all wrote to the to Welsh Government or to Dr. Chris Jones, who was the Deputy Chief Medical Officer in Wales, voicing their concerns. They also wrote to the Welsh Commissioners WISC, because we felt that as haemophilia care, the commissioners in Wales should pay for that, because this is part of haemophilia care. These people just didn't go out in the street and catch these viruses. It should be part of the National Service Specification. Basically, the clinicians were ignored, and we just had to go back to lobbying through the cross-party group then. And without their intervention, it would have been ignored. We wouldn't have got anywhere. So obviously all our Assembly members started asking questions in the Assembly and putting the Health Minister on the spot. And without that collaboration from both the medical profession and the politicians, we just wouldn't have got it.
And ultimately, you asked Assembly Member Julie Morgan to write to the new Health Minister,
yes,
who agreed to reconvene the Task and Finish group,
yes,
just for a single meeting to discuss the implementation of the earlier report.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, because basically there was no progress. No one was going to pick up the bill for this, neither the Health Board nor the commissioners. And basically, we were just being fobbed off. So we made some very angry representations at one of the group meetings, and Julie agreed that she would start lobbying on our behalf to make sure that the Task and Finish group recommendations were implemented.
And ultimately, a gastroenterologist was appointed.
Yeah, so after all of that, and after all the clear representations, as I say, we knew the patients know what they want, they know what they need. They are the experts by experience, and they are the people who they can, if you ask any patient, you know, some people are a little bit more reticent, but basically when somebody says in a meeting, oh, I'm having difficulty with this, you'll always get other people, and that gives people confidence then to talk about it. But basically, we obviously spoke to our clinicians about it, and they gave us direction about the sort of post we were looking for, and that was because we have a good relationship with them, and we want to work to try and get the best for the survivors. But basically, they ignored that to, I suppose, dampen down the angry noises. Then they said, well, they were appointing a gastroenterologist, but again, this gastroenterologist, he was just up to here with all his general gastroenterology, so he didn't have time to we wouldn't have time to see the haemophilia patients unless it was an absolute emergency, and that was the very scenario we wanted to avoid, because we felt that our group of patients, under the circumstances of their infection, they deserve to have that care where they're monitored and they have a comprehensive care package to avoid people decompensating and not being referred to the appropriate specialists. If they're under the care of a consultant hepatologist, they're monitored, they're specialists, they know exactly if things start to go wrong, those patients get a chance then, because they can be put forward for liver transplant. Whereas if they're unmonitored, liver disease is called the silent killer, and there are lots of people in our group who maybe outwardly aren't showing many symptoms, but inside their liver is failing, and they may go on for years without decompensating, but very often it'll happen very suddenly, and then it's an emergency admission, and then it's too late, and a cancer has grown, and people just die because of that.
And there was also some delay in the person joining the trust because they were doing some further hepatology training.
Yeah, and he wasn't a specialist hepatologist, but we did eventually get our consultant hepatologist then. 2015, Dr. Srivastava, he started, and again he sees the haemophilia clinic patients during clinic time. We still feel that the stage 1s should be monitored, even though they've cleared the virus. They don't have an active virus now, but it's really important that monitoring takes place to prevent, it being an emergency admission. And as I say, but that's of no consequence to the transfusion people, because unless they're attending the hospital, the stage 1s they're just off the radar, and they say they're cured, and they're not cured, and they're not called back.
Council, might I support what Lynne's saying here? We've got a bit of an obsession in Scotland about care plans, and we've had different experience in relation to hepatology support. In 2006, there was an action plan to eventually rid Scotland of hepatitis C. That's for everyone, and in some parts of Scotland that's almost been achieved, and now within the haemophilia community, it's certainly, as far as I'm aware of, if you wanted treatment you could get hepatology treatment. But the point here that's coming out from this sort of what Lynne's talking about, where you've pioneered in Wales in relation to psychological support, you've also got support in terms of benefits, but hepatology hasn't necessarily always been there. And there are psychological support. What we actually, my obsession is for a care plan for people who've been affected by this, and in some cases I include families in that, and I see huge benefit in that. One of the problems we've identified with this, and I think Lynne's touching on it here in relation to blood transfusion, is who would be the lead professional? From which particular field would they come from, in terms of that agreement between the patient and the NHS, because we know that there are very complex needs and comorbidities, and it's something that we've been seeking to raise through our network in Scotland, Inherited Bleeding Desert network. But as Lynne says, it's about people with blood transfusions as well.
And just picking up on the network in Scotland, one of the things you've also been trying to work on is improving the psychology service in Scotland. differently to Wales because Wales, you were successful in it. What's happened with Scotland in terms of psychology?
Well, until very recently, Wales were ahead of us. And I think it goes back to the report the King's Fund drew up in Wales way back. We had support for some years now, and initially it was on a sort of pilot basis for 2 or 3 years for people with haemophilia. That was extended from the Lothian region across Scotland. But only very recently, in fact, the appointments have just been made within the last couple of weeks for people who are either had blood transfusions, who are in a nearby hospital, or in some cases, frankly, families who've lost loved ones, they don't want to go near a haemophilia unit. So that's available to them. But I am aware that there's been close liaison between those two parts.
And that's been through the Scottish Inherited Bleeding Disorders Network.
No, let me clarify here that this is Scottish Government's, the other part of it, the non-haemophilia part of it. But I believe the psychologist from the haemophilia world was actually involved in the interview panel for the people with transfusions and families.
And just staying on psychological support while we're on it, Simon, in relation to Northern Ireland, we heard from Dr. Benson that there's been additional psychological support established at the Belfast Centre in the context of this inquiry. What's your involvement been in relation to that?
Yes, absolutely. I think really, and I was listening to what Lynne and Bill were saying, I think really in terms of dating it, it certainly is something which was post the beginning of the inquiry. In a sense, I would probably associate that with the terms of reference of the inquiry. I think there's been a movement by the Belfast Trust to acknowledge issues around mental health. We have a dedicated psychologist. That post is very shortly going to be made permanent. In fact, that date may already have passed. I haven't heard the final result, but I'm aware that service has been used and utilised and is offered right across the province. Under the pandemic, that process has been promoted through Zoom or Teams, and accessibility continues. Some of the benefits of that process are that it has enlightened us really that there's a need not just in terms of dealing with the traumas that have arisen out of the public inquiry and contaminated blood, but the general issues of trauma and psychological disturbance which come for families when they have haemophiliacs who have serious bleeds and serious accidents which occur, and also for individuals as well. So I think there's a realization that this service is a service which will have a broader use and a broader usefulness in terms of the patient care and family care for those suffering or within the blood-contaminated community, certainly in terms of haemophilia and anyone related to the public inquiry. In relation to the other issues that were raised earlier on about hepatology and the service itself, I can only speak personally. We haven't had any real anecdotes of people who are not happy with that service, so I can't identify that. I can say in terms of myself as a stage 2 cirrhosis sufferer that only the other day I had a phone call asking me to go for a blood test. So that reassures me that even through this process, when it's difficult to access monitoring continues. And that's reassuring. And in terms of my brother, my twin brother, who developed cancer and had a liver transplant, that service delivered him into good health very well. And I hope that is the case for others. My understanding of any folk that we have come into contact with has been that it has been a reasonable experience.
Just before we leave the sort of campaigning in relation to clinical issues, Lynne, you were heavily involved in lobbying for access to interferon-free treatments. What response did you get when you raised the question of providing that?
Right, so that came about because when I was a trustee of the Haemophilia Society, I was asked by the chair basically couldn't attend a meeting, and he asked one of us to attend. And when the email came through, I saw that it was going to be an important meeting. It was in the Department of Health, and it was a hepatitis C workshop. And the chair of the meeting was Ben Cole, who was somebody that I'd met previously and had walked out of meetings when the Haemophilia Alliance was dissolved, and nobody would stand up and agree with what I was saying. So I had a bit of a history with him. So I thought, right, I'm going to go to that meeting. And when I went there, there were presentations from leading hepatologists on the new interferon-free treatment. So this was December 2013. And basically, I spoke to Professor DeShaco from the Royal Free after the meeting. I obviously spoke at the meeting and said we were having difficulty because we couldn't even get our patients monitored at that time. And he told me that there had been no input from the infected blood cohort to any of the previous meetings, which shocked me. There had been input from the Hepatitis C Trust through lived experience, but the person hadn't been infected through contaminated blood. That person had had hepatitis C through other means. And basically, he said that we're trying to, as hepatologists, we are trying to lobby for an early access scheme prior to NICE approval. So I emailed, he gave me his email address and I emailed him, and he gave me the information which demonstrated that, they were basically lobbying NHS England to pay for these drugs because they knew there was near to 100% success rate, particularly with the non-responders or the people who hadn't cleared the treatments with 3 or 4 previous interferon treatments. So he sent me the email, and then I contacted one of our Welsh patients who was at the stage where their liver was decompensating, and as a favour we'd asked for Professor Thirst, who I can say the doctor's name, right? Professor Thirst, who's at St Mary's in London, to monitor him. And Professor Thirst is a leading hepatologist, and he kindly agreed to see one of our patients because this man was going to die basically if he hadn't been seen. And he didn't want to wait. His brother had already died, so he didn't want to wait to get to the stage where the liver, the cancer had developed outside the liver. And Professor Thirst saw him, and when I emailed him, he immediately replied back to me and said, I think you've got the emails in my evidence, but he says that we're trying to lobby for early access. And he said there's no representation from the infected blood community. He said there's a press conference the next day at the King's Fund. And he said we're trying to push NHS England to pay for these treatments because we know they're working. So he said, would you be able to come? And myself and a few others from our group, we went up to the King's Fund and we spoke about what was happening. And of course, the people there, we met, there were obviously all sorts of, people who had been infected by different means, but everybody was really friendly to us. And, they said, we had no idea that, your group could be infected in that way. So basically, I reported all of that back to the Haemophilia Society, and I should add that when I went to the workshop, which was chaired by Ben Cole, I did actually ask for Joseph Peaty to come with me because he's got a background in statistics. He's one of the, can I say his name?
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure, sorry.
Can we just pause the transmission just in case? I didn't think it was redacted. I don't think the name is mentioned in your statement, so I'm not sure if it's due to be redacted.
Sorry.
I think better refer to him neutrally if you can.
Thank you, sir.
Sorry, can you say that?
If you refer to him neutrally,
Okay.
if you can,
Right, okay.
rather than by name.
Okay, right. Sorry. So
We're back on.
Thank you, sir.
one of the the campaigners in England. He had a background in statistics, and I knew that he would be able to help me at the meeting, and I asked for him to come, and that was refused. So that's how I went on my own. And again, I thought that was wrong, because there was no other representation at the meeting apart from the Hepatitis C Trust. So basically, we went to the meeting and to the press conference. We spoke about, how our group were being denied the drugs. I reported all of this back to the Haemophilia Society, because I was a trustee at the time. So if I did anything, I would always have to report it back to the board, and to get sort of board approval to do these things. So I sent an email to Bernard Manson and Liz Carroll, reporting what I'd found, and I said, look, we need to be really lobbying government now to get this moving. And basically, they just didn't understand. They didn't understand what the urgency was about. But when you know the people so well, you know them personally, and you know it could save their lives, you think, well, for many, that was the only hope they had.
Sorry, so we've had a response from Bernard Manson challenging that position, and he would say he did understand. Can I just focus your answer, Lynne, back on what I was asking about?
Sorry, yeah.
And that is about what you did in relation to lobbying the Welsh government for access.
Okay, so what I did then was I sort of felt I was just blocked, really, in both areas, and so I resigned, and I just thought, well, it was easier to not have to report back to the Haemophilia Society, that we would do it ourselves in Wales. We already knew we knew the Welsh government, we knew the politicians. So through the All Wales Advisory Group that I sat on, I made a case for, there were less than 10, I think it was between 6 and 10 people in Wales at the time who needed the treatment. And basically, we just appealed to the commissioners to, please, can you fund this treatment? Because if they don't have it, they're going to die anyway. So this was prior to NICE approval. Going back, I'm sorry, I've missed a bit, because the important bit was that Professor Thirst said in his email, and it is documented, it's in my evidence, that there were all sorts of obstacles being put in the way by NHS England as to why they shouldn't fund the treatment. And Professor Thirst said they were inventing the obstacles, he said, as they went along then. And he blamed the chief pharmacist. I probably better, can I say his name?
Absolutely.
Malcolm Qualley. So he was the pharmacist who was preventing that happening. Professor Thirst and the hepatologists took real exception to it. Matthew Cramp was involved, the hepatologist from Plymouth. And they were the experts, they were the specialists, they were the doctors, they were saying what needed to happen. And this was being contested by the NHS commissioners, and a pharmacist who knew nothing about hepatology, nothing about liver disease, and they would have the final say. So the decision was basically just on funding. It was nothing to do with clinical need.
Can I take you back to Wales and what you did in relation to the Welsh government?
Yeah, so then we went to Welsh government. Obviously, I brought this up at the All Wales Advisory Group. And basically, we were able to get an interim commissioning policy for the severely ill, and that was quite early. That was in the summer.
2nd of July 2014.
Yeah. So I resigned from the society, and we just did it as our own group then, and we got an interim commissioning policy. And out of this, there were 6 patients, but 2 of them went on to have liver transplants, and that they're still alive. So they had the treatment, and whereas we'd known so many in our group then that had died because they couldn't clear the treatment, and once they had a transplant, the tumours came back with greater force than ever before. This was a chance of life for these people.
I should say that we've had a response from Malcolm Qualley, which will be published on our website in due course. He rejects the contention that NHS England were inventing the process of making direct-acting antivirals available to patients, and rejecting the contention that NHS England was creating hurdles to their access. I just want to pick up one other matter which Lynne, you've been very involved in, and Simon, in relation to achieving a coordinated approach to access to medical records. Lynne,
Sorry, can I just say one? I'm sorry to interrupt, but we then did get, even though we had the interim commissioning policy, we then had it rolled out for the whole of Wales. So everybody within that year, regardless of how advanced their liver disease was, through the bloodborne viral action plan, everybody was treated, and that was in conjunction with the hepatologists in Wales. And basically, they treated everybody, and there was no waiting list. So we didn't have any of the problems that they had in England with accessing treatments or having to show that they had cirrhosis before they were given the treatment. Sorry.
Then in relation to access to medical records for the purposes of the inquiry, you worked to achieve a coordinated approach to that, didn't you?
Yes.
And the end result was a single email address that patients could email for their medical records.
Yeah.
And then it's right, isn't it, that you wrote to all the chief executive officers of the Welsh health boards,
Yes.
asking for a concerted approach to
And they all agreed to do that, and they were really helpful. And the records office in the Cardiff, they had one person who coordinated everything. So if people needed their medical notes, they could email this one person, and she would make it her job then to make sure that all those notes were put together to save distress to patients then and their families.
And Simon, you've worked similarly with the Belfast Trust, meeting them on a number of occasions to agree an approach to accessing medical records.
Yes, that's correct. This really stemmed from a problem with my brother Nigel. When he sought records initially, he had difficulty accessing them. And in fairness, the Trust came back. We talked to our legal team, Watkins and Gunn, who were extremely helpful with this process. And they accompanied us to several meetings with the Trust. Those were positive meetings. In fairness, we felt that the Trust was very willing to cooperate and help. And I think the background to that is because of the changes in the management of records over a long period of time. We're talking back 30, maybe 40 years. It was an industrial task, to quote the Trust, finding that information and accessing it. But I have to say, we had a number of meetings, and those meetings potentially could have been ongoing, but we found a very useful method in the sense that we had a contact from the legal team who worked with a contact from the Trust, and that's expedited the process of accessing materials. And we were very impressed that some of Nigel's records, which initially couldn't be found, dating back to handwritten records in a particular kind of logbook, were found somewhere in the archives of one of the buildings where all the records were being kept. And I think that facilitated the expeditious identification of records across the Belfast Trust and further afield for other sufferers within Northern Ireland. Yes, so that was a good experience and a positive one. And I think an observation I would have made from some of the public local meetings which were held during the public inquiry, that individuals who had worked on their own, who had gone independent, as it were, struggled to find records or to access them as easily.
This is the final substantive topic before we deal with just a couple of matters, and it's relatively brief. Bill, you've said in your statement that funding for Haemophilia Scotland remains a formidable challenge. What can you tell us about that in terms of the position?
Well, I take my hat off to my colleagues here. Simon has no support in terms of employees, and nor does Lynne. So I stand in awe. Because we are fortunate to have two members of staff. I'm afraid I was a bit grumpy in my written statement in terms of the demands that this inquiry has made on us, because obviously it's taken a lot of effort, and we're now in a position in Scotland where, in order to secure the continuing employment of our chief executive and our engagement officer, we basically have to do it on a funded basis. I have long experience of this. Advocacy is a desperately difficult thing to get funded. Support family events. Lynne's ran family events, as has Simon in Northern Ireland. But in the initial years when we became established, we were in the fortunate position to employ Dan Farthing, who previously worked for the Haemophilia Society and had huge experience of the issues involved and has given a written statement. And for the first 3 years, we got £100,000 a year from government. That then came down to 60,000 to 50,000, and recent times has been 25,000. Now, you can't pay two salaries on £25,000. So, yes, please, I remember badgering Lynne and indeed Simon about all of this. You guys need to get some money out of this, because you can't go on like this.
Lynne, what's your experience?
Well, our concern as a group, as I say, we're all volunteers. We didn't want it to curtail our campaigning, because we thought if we were having funding from Welsh Government, we might be restricted on how much we could campaign for a public inquiry, whereas we were sort of able to say what we wanted at meetings and we could challenge them. So I understand, the difficulties, and I suppose I'm the chair, and I run it from my home, but our trustees all will have other jobs as well, and this is a full-time job for me. But I just, but it's worth it to get justice for everybody. So it's not top of our priority list at the moment, because we want the inquiry to report.
Simon, any views?
Well, we're a small organisation. We're all volunteers as well, so that resonates very much with me, what Lynne was saying. And I do appreciate Bill's help and guidance when we were starting up. It's been very useful to be able to pick up the phone and get ideas from others with more experience. Issues around funding. The reality of funding is it would enable us to provide better services, better advocacy, and more help to those that we are trying to serve. And I think that is the reality. We will always be a small organisation with a very small turnover, but all of that money goes back into events and guidance, and we have good relationships with the clinic, and we can draw on experts from there and be given a little guidance. We have regular meetings with the consultant, Dr. Benson, on an annual basis to discuss issues and needs, and to share ideas and to give our feedback to him. But we are really... We would appreciate a little more understanding from the department, and I'm fairly confident with my own general experience of life that we would not be incumbent on the department if we were given some support. It was difficult enough to actually find access to a room. This meeting today is taking place from my place of work in the boardroom, and that's where we've held our meetings, by and large, because it was virtually impossible to access anywhere else. In all of those numerous buildings that are empty and vacant in the evenings within the 3 hospital services which are within the vicinity of Belfast, we find it difficult to believe that we couldn't access anywhere. But we're happy to go it alone. We're happy to do it our way if that's the way it has to be done, and we'll continue to do that. But there's no doubt about it, additional funding would make a big difference to the kind of service and the kind of information and the benefits to the people we're trying to serve.
Could I just pick up Lynne's point, because I think it's a very important point here about who pays, because this is an issue that's arisen in relation to pharmaceutical funding as well. I think we've possibly all had, for specific events, had pharma money for specific events.
We've had it, if we've done, like we do children's events, so we'd ask for funding for a one-off, a weekend, because obviously as a charity we rely on donations. And for us to raise £10,000 to take all the children in Wales on a weekend, that's a lot of money for us. So we usually, we ask pharma, we don't always get it, but we ask for it, but it has no influence over what we're doing. And we support the families, but I think we run it very much as a basic charity. We do a lot of advocacy work for people of all ages with haemophilia. We've also strangely enough, we've also made friends with lots of transfusion families and victims as well. But as regard the public inquiry has to be the most urgent thing now for us, rather than funding.
The point being, in relation to what Lynne's saying, our integrity is such as trustees of a charity that we would not be influenced by that pharmaceutical firm if we were to run an event such as Lynne's talking about. And it's very specific to that particular event. The other matter, and unfortunately Dan has a sore experience of this, the regulations around pharmaceutical funding are becoming tighter and tighter.
Final two questions. When you reflect on your campaign work, the three of you, and that of those you know in the community, why, in your view, have efforts in the campaign been resisted in the ways we've spoken of over the time?
Well, I think there's a deliberate attempt to cover up what happened. The government doesn't want to get to the truth. And so whichever way you attack it, there are just obstacles in the way and the progress is blocked. There are falsehoods about the events that happened, and that just gets repeated and repeated and repeated by successive governments, because, as I think it was Bill said earlier, the civil servants don't change. Those civil servants are in post for a number of years, and the civil servants, they have that mantra, they invent that mantra. We saw it with the self-sufficiency, the Department of Health's report on self-sufficiency. So basically, we had the Archer inquiry, 2007. In 2006, the Department of Health, they published a report. It's not named, it's just the Department of Health, blood products and self-sufficiency in the UK from 1971 to 1973 to 1991. And in that, basically all the falsehoods that the government has supported over the years, and that's repeated in the House of Lords, and it's repeated in correspondence to victims. When people write to their MPs, you get a standard letter from the Department of Health saying that there was no fault, everything was done, this report has been issued, and basically, it was an accident, and it's not an accident.
Bill, Simon?
Yeah, if I could, I think inevitably government and the structures of government, i.e. the civil service, have forgotten their calling. And their calling is to serve honourably and honestly. And I think they have neglected that charge. I think as a consequence, they have forgotten that we depend on them, and therefore their chief responsibility is to look after us properly. And when that doesn't happen, and it may not happen for a number of reasons, it is their responsibility then, paternally and maternally, to accept that they must do things to make that different. The key fact really is, it is not the responsibility of government, and it shouldn't be, of a morally responsible government to defend the past when the past is wrong. Their responsibility is to address the future and provide a resolution and a solution in the future. The only people who are capable of doing that are government ministers in the highest parts of office. They are responsible, they take the knock, they are responsible for making the decisions, and they should take those decisions and accept that it is perfectly all right to say something was done incorrectly and wrongly in the past, and to address it better for the future. That is doing their job as we expect them to do it, and that's all that I could say on the matter.
Bill?
Yes. Government. If ever there was evidence of government, of us scaring them, having harmed us, having not looked after people and allowed people to die through NHS treatment. It's the issue of Crown immunity. Now, my understanding is that some bright spark somewhere in government sought to exert this on us. We're not soldiers, we're people that were harmed. So my understanding is that legally it could never actually have been applied to us. But what worries me here is that they were scared of us. They'd done something to us that they didn't like. Some bright spark somewhere came up with this idea. So let's dampen this down. Let's defend ourselves against this people, like Susan Deakin did in the early days of the Scottish Parliament. Let's fight them in the courts. Let's do everything we can to stop this. So I welcome the tenacity of this inquiry. And I really hope that we get to the bottom of places, get into places we've never been able to get in this story. We've at least had the advantage in Scotland with the 15-year rule. What about the 30-year rule? What about the 50-year rule that might be exerted upon all of this? So, yes, I agree. I think government doesn't... We had a duty of candour in Scotland that was introduced after... The idea started to flourish after 2007. We gave evidence because we'd felt the whole cover-up thing needs to stop. Let's open things up. Unfortunately, that doesn't apply strategically. It only applies in cases, in clinical circumstances. Sorry, I've just got cramp. So we need to...
If you want to stand up, that's fine.
Thank you, sorry, sir. Oh, dear.
But Bill, I would say that from my experience, and I think yours is the same, it's the civil servants. The governments change, but the civil servants remain. And, you know, it's rotten. With regard to this, rotten to the core.
And I mean, I'd say, sir, that one of, you know, Lynne, the number of times you must have travelled backwards and forwards between Cardiff and London. And Simon and I haven't done that. We live in the outer Celtic reaches rather than the closer Celtic reaches. But for me, these people are a waste of time. You know, I think we do want... Government's going to have to take some action as a result of this inquiry. And the inquiry, the words, we're investigating a cover-up. Thank you. I think that's what needs to happen. The only problem is it's 10, 20, 30 years too late.
And I think also for us, you know, it's very difficult to get meetings with ministers. It's only that, you know, I was fortunate through Della, who lost her son, and Lynne, who is Baroness, that we were able to get access to those meetings, and she was able to then ask questions in the House of Lords about, you know, like the 10-year rule, as the reason for the destruction of Lord Owen's papers, and Lynne was able to get it confirmed that by Lord Prior of Brampton that there is no 10-year rule. So, you know, they're just lies. The Department of Health self-sufficiency report, that's now been withdrawn, and that's down to Lynne opening the doors for her and I to go to the meetings. It just wouldn't have happened, and to challenge those key officials in the blood policy unit, like Rowena Geacock, who over the years must have seen all of the people in Wales, all the campaigners in Wales that have died and made false promises to them and ignored them. You know, it's disgusting. And yet they're in positions of authority, and they block and they block and they block, because it's all about money and just covering it all up.
Council, can I make one further observation about this point? It's not just a failure in government and governance. The parliamentary process, if you look at what's happened in Westminster, we've had umpteen health committee examinations of this matter in Scotland. Has the Westminster Parliament's health committee ever seriously looked at this matter in all the decades it's happened.
So those are the questions I have for the panel. I'm conscious that we need some time for the recognised legal representatives to indicate if they have any further questions. I wonder if we might take a short break for me to be able to do that.
Well, yes. How long do you think we might need?
20 minutes?
So shall we then say 5:15, no earlier than?
Thank you, sir.
But be ready for 5:15, if you please.